Hello, and welcome to MTSS in Preschool for Behavior Support by Samantha Homka. Welcome. In this PowerPoint, you will find professional learning about how to implement a multi-tiered system of support in an early childhood setting. Challenge behaviors are one of the biggest reasons that teachers leave the early childhood education field, which is why I just decided to focus on behavioral supports, because within those behaviors, it will also support academically and socially, emotionally as well for the children. Our mission at our center is to educate young children socially, emotionally, and academically through play. This topic helps support teachers in educating the whole child, which is what our mission is. MTSS is helping to support the whole child, not just parts of the child or bits of the child. It is to help support the whole child and getting him the tools, resources, and supports that they might need to be able to succeed in our classrooms. In this PowerPoint, this is what our topics we will be going through. We'll talk about what inclusion is, the benefits of inclusion, the benefits of an MTSS system, barriers of an MTSS system in our setting, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 behavioral supports that we could be doing in our setting, data collecting, and our next steps. From this PowerPoint, I will hope that you will learn the benefits of MTSS, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 tools and resources to implement for behavioral supports, and data we should be collecting and analyzing. So, inclusion, that's what MTSS is all about, is including every child as much as possible. So what is inclusion? It's including everyone in all opportunities in an equitable way, regardless of their ability, gender identity, sexuality, age, and race. Why does this matter? Why does inclusion matter? Inclusion matters because we need to grow as a society. Societal growth helps everyone to feel seen and understood. It takes time, but this type of change is worth the time and resources that it takes. In our Declaration of Independence, it states that everyone is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we are not doing inclusive practices, we are not allowing our students these rights that they are entitled to. If we're not having these inclusive practices, we are not giving our students life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we are not giving them the tools and resources that they will need in the future, we're not allowing them to pursue the pursuit of happiness, which is our guaranteed rights. Who does inclusion benefit? It benefits everybody, not just children that we are choosing to include, not just general ed students. It is benefiting everyone. So these are just some of the benefits that we have seen in inclusion in early childhood in preschool classrooms. So the number one being is that it is helping typically developing peers to improve their social and emotional behaviors, because there is a wide range of abilities. They are having everybody imitate behaviors and skills, which is one of the main reasons why we have our mixed age group of 3 to 5. So our 3-year-olds can imitate our 4 and 5-year-olds, and vice versa. Number 3 is that inclusive classrooms have routines, activities, and opportunities that challenge academic performance, which is something that we're doing all the time. We have routines already built in our classroom, activities already built in our classrooms that's going to challenge everybody. The higher expectations in our classroom lead children to achieve more, gain confidence, and develop independence. Positive social benefits can then continue to be seen in K-12 classrooms, and it has a long, meaningful impact for everybody. It helps everybody to become more understanding, develop positive attitudes towards children that they might not have previously been exposed to, and they're allowing children to becoming more accepting of children with disabilities. So, behavioral supports are so important because one of our biggest challenges as preschool teachers is the challenging behaviors. I want you to know that you're not alone. Many preschool teachers have reported that challenging behaviors are their single greatest concern. That being said, you're not alone, because 33% of preschool age children in the United States show challenging behaviors. And the intensity, frequency, and co-occurrence with other behaviors is what makes the distinction between challenging and normal behaviors. So what is normal for a 3-year-old is not going to be normal for a 5-year-old to be doing. So if you see the intensity of a 3-year-old tantrum in a 5-year-old, that child may need supports. That would be considered a challenging behavior. The intensity and frequency, the amount of time that the behavior is occurring, and how intense the behavior is occurring are two of the biggest things when it comes to the distinguishing between challenging and normal behaviors. So without these tiered supports, or early intervention, they can evolve into more troublesome concerns later in life. These behaviors can also cause our classrooms to feel unsafe and negatively impact the learning environment, which is why we need to address these challenging behaviors in the best way that we can. The next statistic is something that really stood out to me, is that pre-K children are 3 times more likely to be expelled from their program than children in K through 12. We're not really seeing this at our center to say we don't really expel our children, but it is happening in many other centers. We usually take those children from those centers that have been expelled and do whatever we can to help those children be supported um, in whatever way that we can. But the fact that they're 3 times more likely to be expelled than in a kindergarten, I think that number needs to come way, way down, because no child at the age of 3 should feel abandoned or neglected by their teachers, because that's obviously going to have a long-term effect on them and their self-esteem. Challenge behaviors can look different in all classrooms, but they all make teachers feel the same way. They all make them feel burnt out. Which kind of goes back to you're not alone, and that the intensity and frequency of the behaviors are going to be different for everybody. And this is something that I feel like we're doing at our center, is that we are being reactive instead of proactive. So right now we are reacting to the children's behaviors instead of trying to come up with proactive interventions, which is less effective when dealing with challenging behaviors. And by implementing a multi-tiered system of support, it is allowing the teachers to be proactive. We are already setting the terms for the children of, this is what's going to be beneficial for Tier 1 children. This might be beneficial for Tier 2 children. And if this is still not be beneficial, we can start going toward Tier 3 Tier 3 supports, which is most likely going to be a referral for our IU. Going back to the pre-K children are 3 times more likely to be expelled from their program. This is being seen because there is a connection that children who show these behavior problems are more likely to be diagnosed with disorders like ODD, ADHD, or autism spectrum disorder once they are in school-age programs. So by implementing our MTSS program, it's going to help identify those children now and start giving them the tools and resources that they will carry into kindergarten, which will then lower our expulsion rates when their behavior supports and interventions in our classrooms. And by providing teachers behavioral consultations and resources, our expulsion rates should be lowered as well. So by having this MTSS system and having these children identified and diagnosed as early as possible, is going to be beneficial for them and expulsion rates in preschool. So why should we have MTSS? One of the biggest reasons that immediately pops into my head is that it improves our classroom quality. So one of the big things that we are always talking about is our ECHR score. And by using this 3-tier model of our MTSS, positive outcomes are to be expected. It not only improves the children's challenging behaviors, but it also does increase our ECHR score. And this score is so crucial when improving and keeping our high quality centers in the state's eyes. It also decreases externalizing problem behaviors because it improves their social emotional learning. By improving their social emotional learning, we are allowing them to see what emotions they have and how they can handle those emotions, because emotional regulation is not something that is immediately known in ourselves. It's something that we need to be taught. And right now we have a window of opportunity to reduce negative life effects, which is something that I know many of us want to do. Children who are showing early behavior problems are considered at-risk students for peer rejection, teacher rejection, limited opportunities for learning appropriate behaviors, and the continued problems that go along later in this lifetime. Research has shown that there is a window of time for effectively reducing these problem behaviors, which is our time. the time that we are with them right now. And by having this window of opportunity, it will reduce the chance of them becoming chronic instead of temporary. At-risk children who have not learned adaptive behavior patterns by the end of 3rd grade are unlikely to exceed in eliminating the behaviors if external supports are absent. So if we can identify them in preschool and give them the tools and resources now, they can start to learn those behaviors and start to learn what is needed by the time they are in 3rd grade, because once they hit 3rd grade, without supports, they are going to do less, like they're going to have more behaviors. They're going to feel rejection from their peers. They're going to feel rejection from their teachers. Their self-esteem is going to plummet, which is obviously going to affect them in many, many different ways. And the best part about why having an MTSS is that it can be implemented in our curriculum naturally. So our preschool program, we should try to implement a program-wide positive behavior support plan that we all follow. So instead of one of our classrooms having stickers, or one classroom having tickets, or one classroom having points, we should all come up with what we want to do as a center, and something that we are all comfortable doing with as teachers. So that way, whenever other students are inside of our classrooms, we are able to still give them those positive reinforcements, external reinforcements that they might need. So that's something that we could easily do in our center. Another thing is our developmental screening. So our ASQs and ASQSEs should be occurring at least 2 or 3 times during the preschool year to detect any developmental issues in children, which is part of RTI. So by having these screeners implemented, and actually doing them the 2 to 3 times a year that we're supposed to, we are identifying children that may be considered at risk, and giving them those supports that they might need in Tier 2 or Tier 3. So why don't we have an RTI MTS system already in place? So there's many different reasons and a lot of different barriers that we have in our realm. So the first one being is that we are not regulated. We have different accreditations and fundings and money coming from a whole bunch of different sources. Just take our 3 classrooms, for example. We have private pay, we have pre-K counts, we have EHS, and all 3 of those have different standards through the state's eyes and through their fundings. We also have NACE that we have to look at, and we also have the state that we have to look at, and they're not always on the same page, which is difficult when it comes to these kind of things, because one NACE might say one thing is okay to do, and the state might say another thing is okay to do, or not okay to do. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges. The next challenge is that there's a different curriculum in grade schools, which is where MTSS is being seen. So grade schools are made with research-based curriculum and teacher-led activities, while preschool is a mixture of the curriculum and teacher-guided and child-directed activities. We are meant to take the things that the children are interested in and make them into our curriculum. So right now we have our research-based curriculum, the creative curriculum, where we have different studies that the children get to pick from based on their interests and what they want to learn about. But we are not necessarily having traditional lessons that you would see in a 1st grade classroom, which makes it a little harder to implement the MTSS system. Research-based interventions may not be developmentally appropriate for our 3 to 5-year-olds. What is right for a 5th grader to be doing, or what is right for a 5th grade intervention, might not be what is right or developmentally appropriate for a 3-year-old. So sometimes we do need to get a little creative of how we should be adapting these interventions to make sure that we are using them the best way that we can. Right now, we do have a lack of special education involvement, so we do not have a special education teacher like many grade schools, well, all grade schools do, and that's not happening in early childhood education. It's not a requirement for preschool teachers to have their teacher's license, and there's an education gap, which we have seen at our center. We have seen people who don't have a degree in education or a degree in special education and try to implement tier 1 supports, and they're not doing it successfully because they are not having the tools and resources that other teachers have because of the education that they've received. So we need to try to fill that gap by talking to each other and having monthly meetings. We also do not have that special education teacher in our building, so we can't go to them if we're having troubles and talk to them and get tips and ideas from them, because after we refer a child to the IU and they get IU resources, we're not allowed at those IEP meetings or IFSP meetings unless the parent puts us on there. So we need to make sure that we are advocating for ourselves to be involved in that process, because we need to connect the IU and the preschool classroom a little bit more so that we are all on the same page of what the child's goals are and what supports that child may need, because we are with that child more than the IU is and what the IU has seen. Another challenge that we have is that we do have a wide age range. So our classrooms do have children between the ages of 3 to 5. So selecting target behaviors with children can be difficult. There are children who just turned 3 and some children who just turned 5 in the same classroom. So the target behaviors for your 3-year-old children are going to be different than the target behaviors for your 5-year-old children. For your 3-year-old children, you are developmentally going to be working on potty training. You're developmentally going to be working on singing songs and trying to get them to understand phonological awareness. While with your 5-year-olds, they might know all of their letters and all of their numbers, and figuring out their target behaviors academically is going to affect their behavioral as well, because if we are not challenging that 5-year-old and still doing what we're doing with our 3-year-olds, with our 5-year-olds, they are going to act out because they need to be challenged a little bit more to make sure that they are meeting their academic goals. And then the last part, which I know is something that I am guilty of, is implementing these things with fidelity. So this is making sure that we are giving that reward to that child every single time. We are making sure that we are following up with that child every single time. If we are using one of the tier 1 supports like a visual schedule, we are making sure that we are doing it throughout the entire day. So making sure that we are implementing at least one of these supports to start with as best as we can with fidelity. So now we can start talking about the actual tiers. So the first tier is tier 1, or the universal tier. And there's 2 levels of this. There is the nurturing and responsive relationships and creating high quality supporting environments. So this is making sure that we are being nurturing to our children and making sure that we are responding to our children and interacting with our children and building those relationships so that they will more than likely listen to us later. We're also creating those high quality supportive environments. So we are still challenging those 5-year-olds. We are still challenging those 3-year-olds and holding high expectations for both. The next part of this is to build a parent-teacher relationship, because it is so critical to do this, especially at the beginning of the school year, so that whenever we are having difficult situations, we're able to discuss them with the parent. Because if we do not have a good relationship with that parent and we just come off the bat and talk about the child displaying challenging behaviors, we might be creating a negative relationship with the child and the parent. So by having that positive relationship, it's going to be easier to have those discussions with the parents. So making sure that we're communicating with them in the most simple way, because it's easy for us to get caught up in the daily stress of teaching and forget to use the simple strategies and establish and maintain those positive relationships, which is something that I know we all get caught up in. And keeping our emotions out of conversations with interactions is hard and can be trying, but we have to make sure that we're trying to be as objective as we can whenever connecting with the parents and the children. The next one is something that I think we all have in our classrooms already, which is a visual schedule, but making sure that we are actually using the visual schedule and not just having it up on our walls. So making sure that we are following along and making sure the children know where we are throughout the day, and following along with transitions. The next universal tier is having clear expectations and that all of our classrooms have the same rules. So I know in my classroom we have the 2 rules, be safe, be kind, but we can also add be respectful. In early childhood, we should use language that matches what we are teaching or what is already in their vocabulary. We should be talking about these main rules, what they look like in different settings, which goes along with teaching these behavior expectations, which is another point later down the line. Because if we are not talking about what these main rules look like in different settings, they might not know. These children are not inherently know what being safe looks like on the playground versus the classroom. They might not know what being safe looks like in Miss Beth's classroom or my classroom or Miss Kristen's classroom because they can't generalize it. As well as we might think that they should, or as well as we expect them to. So we have to explicitly teach those behaviors and teach those rules and talk about what being safe, being kind, and being respectful looks like in all of those different settings. We shouldn't be having more rules than that because our children are so young that they should not be having more rules. We can talk about little rules, but those are the 3 big rules. We can talk about walking feet in the classroom. That's being safe. And that's an expectation. The next thing is to have these behaviors visually. Our children cannot read. So making sure that we do have them visually so that we can just go up to that and be like, was running around this classroom being safe, and bringing that child to that role so they can make the connection between running is not safe, or walking is safe, or making that connection visually and not just verbally. So some tier 2 supports, which I will get into more in the next slide, are some social stories. So social stories can be used for target behaviors or challenge behaviors, and they really focus in on that behavior of what is happening and what should be happening or what should be expected of that or during those times. Another system is a check-in, check-out system, and this could be used for a child who is seeking adult attention because you are giving them that one-on-one. Having sensory tools in your classroom. This will help regulate emotions and help with challenging behaviors, which I think most of us have in our quiet corner, which is great. And then another one is self-monitoring, which also is going to help with challenging behaviors and help the child build more independence. So this is an example of a check-in, check-out system, which we have seen different versions of this. This is a really good example of one because it shows the visual of what is happening at each time. So this can match your visual schedule. Whenever you do start this check-in, check-out system, you will have to individually talk with that child of what a happy face might look like at morning meeting by being safe, respectful, and kind. And what a meh face might look like at morning meeting by how does it involve being safe, being kind, being respectful. We have to go back to those rules as much as we can to make sure that we are instilling and teaching those rules. A sad face, what would that look like at morning meeting in regards to being safe, being kind, and being respectful? And then after morning meeting, you would talk about what it is, what they got, what they think they got, why they think they got that, and go through about being safe, being kind, being respectful. And then before moving on to the next thing, you will talk to them about, this is what I expect to get a happy face. This is what I expect to get this face. This is what I would expect to see to get this face. To cut some time, you can just talk about what your expectation is with that happy face. Because by setting that high expectation, they are more likely going to achieve that high expectation. But again, before moving on to the next thing in your visual schedule, talking about what it is and how well they did it afterwards with fidelity. Self-monitoring system. This is similar to a check-in and check-out system, but it's a little different. So this is trying to build more independence with them visually. So I know that I implemented this with a couple of children for morning meeting. We would say their name at the top and it would be at their cushion or at their spot. And we would talk about the rules at morning meeting. How is using my words being safe, being kind? How is using my hands being safe, being kind? My feet are on the floor. That is being safe. That is being kind to others. Staying in our spot is making sure that we are being safe and being kind so that everybody can learn. and just talking about these different expectations before giving this to them. And then at the beginning, you are going to have to work with them one-on-one and giving them a marker, or you can do it to show them what to do. So you would get a marker and you would say, you're using your words, and put a check mark. You have nice hands. Your hands are in your lap. Check mark. You're sitting crisscross applesauce. Check mark. You are raising a quiet hand. Check mark. And so every time they are doing those things, you would put a check mark. And then slowly you would let them do it. You would model it and then let them do it to the best of their ability. And then you can always change these up so that it has their interest in it, so that they are more interested and engaged in doing it. So then you would move on. If these tier 2 supports are not working, you might have to move on to tier 3 supports. And some of these supports are some things that we would not necessarily have to be doing. So the biggest thing would be the referral to the IU to get them evaluated so that they can make a functional behavioral assessment and a behavior intervention plan if it is needed. So these 2 forms are some things that you necessarily won't have to do as a preschool teacher, because these are more so a special education teacher, but they are still nice to know about. So it's functional behavioral assessment is figuring out what the behavior is and why it is occurring, what the antecedent is, what the consequence is, and what we can do to help limit that behavior. A behavior intervention plan is, what is this negative behavior? How is it affecting other children? And what do we do if this behavior occurs? Which is something more than likely the IU will create. But if we are advocating for ourselves to be at those IEP meetings, this is something that we need to be aware of. Another tier 3 support is having structured breaks built into the day. So making sure that the children know that if they are needing a break from morning meeting, they are able to go to the quiet corner. They are able to go to a certain area of the classroom throughout the day if they need a break from other children or learning. Another thing would be to have an individual visual schedule. So it would just be your visual schedule, but you could give the child an expo marker or check marks that they would put on with Velcro as they go through the day. This would most likely be implemented inside of their cubbies, and then as they go through the day, they would go over and put the check mark or put the Velcro dot on to say that we did that and are moving on to the next scenario. So the last thing that we're going to talk about today is data collecting. So with data collecting, the biggest thing right now in our building is that our behavior forms are not universal. So we should all be using one form like we do with our ouch reports, where it states the setting, any triggers or antecedents, the people involved, and the consequences of the behavior, the type of behavior, and the class activity at the time. By collecting this information on a form that we all use, it will allow documentation to be easier to collect and analyze. That's the biggest piece, is that we need to analyze our data. We can't just take it and call it a day. By collecting it and analyzing it, it will give us more time to determine what services and tiered supports may be needed for that child. And by having it universal, instead of me doing one form and Beth doing another form and Kristen doing another form, it will allow us to see what everybody's doing. It will allow us to see, it will help the functional behavior assessment as well. In the tier 3 supports, because we'll be able to see what the antecedent of the behavior is, what the behavior actually is, and what the child is seeking from that behavior. And by having that data in a way and in a safe space in like the office or where we all put it, instead of in like a random binder where we just document what happened to the best of our memory. This form will help us implement it. This form will help us collect it with fidelity. Another thing that we can be doing is having a self-assessment tool for being able to promote positive behavior. So the self-assessment tool could have tier 1 supports that could be put in place for students, and using the same tools for transition. So these are things that we would have to be asking ourselves. What tier 1 supports do we have and put in place? like a predictable classroom environment? Or do we have a visual schedule showing our daily schedule? Are we using the same tools for transitions each time? We should not be defining expectations, but teaching them to our children, which is another thing that can be part of this self-assessment. Are we actually doing that? Are expectations being taught every day? Because they're not going to be taught in one day. We shouldn't be expecting our children that are 3 years old to know what being safe looks like every single day, every single minute of the day. So we need to explicitly teach them, and that's essential. So that's something that also needs to be put into the self-assessment tool. The next thing is to make sure that we are praising and acknowledging children appropriate behavior. These are just things that you need to keep in mind. This should include social behaviors, and when handling a challenge behavior, make sure that the consequence is logical and consistent. So if that child is not cleaning up, what is the logical thing to do? What is that we are going to do every time as a preschool team? If a child is not cleaning, so giving them the choice of what the child can clean up. If this still does not work, we have to give them a prompt. And if that still does not work, we need to come up with a logical consequence and not a punitive one. So if they're not cleaning up, we can't just send them to the table. If they're shouting, we can't just send them to the table. If they're hitting, we can't just send them to the table. Like, that shouldn't be our go-to consequence. And then the last part of the self-assessment tool is, are we collecting data and analyzing it to determine the next steps about behavior? Is it a certain time of day? Is there another tier or tier 2 that should be implemented to see how it affects that time of day? So these are different questions that we should be asking ourselves on a daily basis or monthly basis to make sure that we are implementing MTSS systems to the best of our ability with tier 1 and tier 2 supports. So our next steps. So as a center, I believe that our next step should be creating a universal data collection system so that we all are on the same page of data and actually analyzing that data. The next thing for you guys would be to implement tier 1 supports with fidelity. So your goal should be to pick 1 or 2 to start with and slowly implement more once you're comfortable. So pick 1 or 2 of the tier 1 supports that were earlier in this presentation, and implement it with fidelity. Once you have that down, implement another one. Once you have that one down, implement another one, and keep going back to what you're comfortable with doing, but still implementing as many as possible to make sure that all children are being included. And then another step that we should try to do is set up monthly team meetings where all 3 of us meet, or even are with our co-teachers as well, because they are as much as part of this process as the lead teachers are. And we can talk to our director about this and maybe set up team monthly meetings right after our staff meeting, have half of our staff meeting being what our director and assistant director need to tell us as a center, and having the rest of the staff meeting talking about tier 1 supports, where we need supports, who should we go to whenever we need tips or strategies, because I might have strategies that Kristen doesn't, or Kristen might have strategies that Beth doesn't, or Beth might have strategies that I might like. So we're talking about what we can do with those children, because we're all with the same children. Yes, we have our own classrooms, but there's also times of the day where we're with everybody's kids, and making sure that we're all on the same page of what systems are put in place for those children if they are in tier 2 or tier 3 supports. And that concludes our presentation, and these are all of our references.